So I want to say welcome to Patrick Cassidy Sensei, who's a long-time friend of mine since I think 1987, when the first time I went to Iwama, and Patrick was there already. And so we met as I came as a young guy, and I was Uchideshi for the first time, for a short time, and Patrick had already moved out of the dojo and was a Sotodeshi living there. But I want to start asking Patrick from much earlier on, because as you know, the other Iwama Dialogues is about looking into the spiritual aspects of our lives, and especially how that has evolved and progressed through our lifetime, and through the motivation, inspirations, and our intentions. So I started the other interviews asking about if Patrick, if you may, Patrick, if you like to explain maybe what was it in you that stirred from an early age that maybe led you to go to Japan, leave your home country, and then embark to a great extent on a spiritual journey, actually, where Aikido is a big part of. So if I let you introduce yourself a little bit like that to start.
Sure. Well, you know, I had started the Japanese community in and around the area I grew up was quite strong, and in fact they had a very active judo club in my town, and so I started judo when I was about 7 years old, and but even before then I remember my father bringing me to this one Japanese fish market in the town that's nearby that he would often visit, and they used to have this gift shop, and it was kind of old gift shop that they had all these different artifacts from Asia and specifically Japan, and as a kid I would walk through it and have this sense that I was coming into contact with something that I felt very at home in, and ever since then I'd always been kind of engaged with the sense of visiting Japan and Asia and the East. But part of, you know, obviously growing up at that time and being influenced by the culture and watching all the episodes of Kung Fu and Bruce Lee, you know, stimulated a lot of the basic interest in martial arts and these things.
Patrick, if you don't mind me asking,
Sure.
where did you grow up?
I grew up in the Central Valley in California, which is a region, the agricultural part. It's a small town called Reedley, and it's in between San Francisco and Los Angeles, and there's a large expat Japanese community in that area because they had immigrated over the years and brought, you know, all during, you know, over the years, there were a lot of Japanese immigration into California that, especially in the agricultural regions of California. And so I came into contact, I had a lot of contact with Japanese culture and early on, and had been, like I said, had been doing judo as a child for quite some time. And it became something that had intrigued me and pulled on me from the time I was very young. But you know, it didn't really occur to me to get to commit to a martial art until I was in university. It was the first year in university that I started Aikido, and I also started yoga at that time. So, and I was doing a lot of meditation, a lot of contemplation, and that became a big part of the investigation of what I felt was necessary for me to kind of develop a better sense of myself. And of course there was a lot of exploration of with drugs at that time, and that type of exploration opened doorways of perception that helped kind of facilitate that deeper investigation. But it was my third year in university that I had been doing a lot of reading of Carlos Castaneda, and that had a huge influence on my thinking process. And so I came to a question at that point in time. I'd been doing Aikido and yoga and like I said, meditation, and I came to a point where I asked myself, if I had 1 year left to live, what would I do? And I took that question very seriously, and I had, at that time, I just had done a couple of different seminars. I'd gone to Esalen, which was a big retreat center in Big Sur. I'd done a seminar with Chiba Sensei in the Bay Area. And then I went down and did a seminar with Saito Sensei for the first time in San Diego. And this is when I had asked this question, if I had 1 year left to live, what would I do? And I discovered that, yeah, I would commit to Aikido. I would commit to Aikido, I would commit to yoga, and I would like to go to Japan. And it just so happened at that time I had found out that Saito Sensei had an Uchideshi program that would enable anybody to do that. And so that was in my fourth year. I was about fourth year in university. I was studying aeronautical engineering, and I realized it's not the direction I wanted to go is in terms of my life path. And so in April 1985, I left for Japan. I was 22 years old, and I stayed for 2 months as Uchideshi. And it was a brilliant experience. It was really beautiful, and it was just a little taste of what I had, of life in Japan. And I was completely, a newbie. I had no idea what I was doing. I had been doing Aikido on and off for about 2.5 years in the university. But, as a university student, that was like once a week at best. And I had my teacher and I he only had one student, that was me. So I would train with him the whole time. It was a different kind of style of Aikido. It was based on Koichi Toei's style of Aikido, Ki Society. And so when I arrived in Japan and I arrived in Iwama, I remember the night, I arrived very late and took a taxi, and I just told them Aikido Dojo, I took a taxi. It's like a 10-minute walk, even less than 10-minute walk from the train station to the dojo, but I had no idea. So I took a taxi and got dropped off at the dojo, and there's this Canadian Uchideshi who welcomed me and poured me a glass of Japanese Suntory red whiskey, and we sat down and we drank, and I was like, oh my God, after jet lag and everything, I was drinking this really terrible whiskey, but it was an amazing experience. And it was an experience of recognizing that I had made a choice. It was the first time I had made a choice, an independent choice on my life path. Because prior to that, everything had been unfolding based on how culture unfolds itself. Where you go to grade school, then you go to high school, and then high school you go to university. And these things were everything that culturally people accepted, people expected of you, and I just followed that expectation. And this was the first time I had broken out of that and had done something completely independent of the cultural conditioning that I had received. And that was an incredibly liberating experience. And so arriving there, and Saito Sensei was very warm. I mean, there were two serious Uchideshi there, Rod Cooper and another guy named Garnett, I think. I want to remember his name. They were both from Canada. And he invited those two and myself over for lunch. And Saito Sensei cooked a brilliant meal. And I was just like, very overwhelmed by the welcome. And at the same time, I was also incredibly intimidated by the harshness of the training and the whole sense of being in this foreign culture. And Saito Sensei was not what I expected him to be. I had envisioned him to be a little bit more like I had imagined O Sensei would be, but his manner and his way of didactics, the way he taught, the way he interacted with the students was very very intense and very very powerful. But it also required a lot of independent state of being centered around him. You just had to be on your toes and ready for the swift changing moods that could go through him. And so that first 2 months of being there, I had stayed with him for, I think he was there for 1 month. Then he went to Europe for a trip for a seminar. And during that time, there was myself and another new Chideshi, even newer than I, who watched over the dojo. And he came back, he goes, okay, he says, well, I'm glad to come back to the dojo and to see that it's still standing, that you didn't burn it down or anything like that. And so I was, it was a very strange place to be, because after I was like completely a newbie, but I was left in responsibility for taking care of the dojo for the week. I think it was a week or 2 weeks that he was gone. And it was just an incredible experience. And after leaving, I think it was in June, I had arrived in April and I left in June. I was there for 2 months. Then I came back the following February, and I stayed for about 3 years after that.
So when you went back to America, did you know then that you just went home and you just gonna return again? Were you?
Yeah, that I had known that. I had realized that was the case. So I just, I got a job in order to save enough funds to come back for a longer stay.
Mm.
And that was pretty clear that's what I'd wanted to do.
Mm.
But it was actually, to tell you the truth, no, that's a very good question. Because I had, at the end of the 2-month stay, I had written myself a letter. And I had wrote down my whole experience. And at the end of the letter, I wrote down to myself, I said, and don't forget, you have to come back and get me. And me meaning who I was, my experience in Japan, basically the part of me that was growing in Japan. And I wrote that to myself. And so when I went back, actually, I had planned on going to changing university and studying psychophysiology in Santa Cruz. I was going to change my major, and I thought I would study psychophysiology, which is a scientific approach to mind-body. And I thought, okay, this would get me closer to Aikido, and I could integrate Aikido into this. And I started working and started saving up money. And then it was like in November, and I got accepted into the university, and the university was going to start in April. And then yeah, it's really interesting you asked me that, because I completely forgot this. I found the letter, and I found the letter, and I read the letter, and I realized, holy crap, I have to go back to Japan. And that's when I shifted gears, and that was about December of December of that year, and then so February I went back to Japan, and it was 85. It was December 85, and then I went back in February 86, and so that was a big deal. I had kind of in a way forgotten. Even I'm saying this now, I'd forgotten the whole event, but I had forgotten that I'd written that letter, and I didn't really stimulate going back until I read it. Yeah.
Did you also do yoga at the time when you came back and pursued that?
Well, I'd started yoga when I started Aikido, both in university, and but yoga is a personal practice that you can carry with you, where Aikido, you know, you need a group, you need a community to continue.
Mm.
But when I had gone to to Japan during that period of time, I had traveled to Tokyo for a couple of days, and I just looked up a yoga school because I wanted to take a class or two. And I found my yoga teacher, Junko Tominaga, and she immediately brought me home to be with her family. I stayed with her for a couple of days. I took a lot of classes, and over the years, during the time I stayed there, and I still have a really good contact with her. Um, she invited me to a number of yoga retreats, and she would do these yoga events, these zazen yoga sessions at monasteries, which were a combination of zazen meditation and yoga during the day, and those were really great. And so she was extraordinarily a big part of my life in Japan while I was in Iwama. And although she was in Tokyo and I wouldn't be able to visit her very often, the contact with her was really life-changing as well. So yoga was a big part of my experience while I was living in Japan. And in a way, yoga saved me, because training in Iwama, if I hadn't been doing yoga, I don't think I would have physically had made it. It was pretty harsh on the body, the training, and to maintain that level of training and stay healthy was a trick that we were all trying to work on while we were living in Japan and training full time.
I remember, Patrick, when I arrived in the spring of, I think, 87 for the first time, that we met. And what I remember from our first meeting is that you actually had been to Rishikesh in India before, and where you pursued this. Was that, had you first come to India as on your way to Japan, or how did that?
No, India came after. And I don't remember. I don't remember if I had been. I thought I didn't go to India until '89, but I don't remember exactly when I went to India. But obviously, it might have been. It might have been at that time. But I had one trip to India for about a month, and then would make regular trips after that, leaving Japan. Because going to India from Japan was a fairly easy trip. It wasn't, you know, you stopped in Bangkok and then it was a fairly long flight, but it was much easier than flying from the States. And yoga was a big, going to Rishikesh and spending time at the Shivananda ashram was something that I would incorporate into my life while living in Japan.
Did you know about the Shivananda ashram from back home?
Yeah, no, I learned about it from my teacher, Junko Tominaga. She was a devotee of the Shivananda ashram, and she had brought over Swami Chidanandaji to do a couple of retreats in a Zen Buddhist monastery near Tokyo, and I had attended that and became very close friends with Swami Vimalanandaji, who had been traveling with Swami Chidanandaji, and we became very close and stayed close until his death, which was just actually last year. And he ended up being the president of the ashram. He was an extraordinary individual, and so that connection was through my yoga teacher in Tokyo. But I think there was a lot of feeling that in the Aikido that was being practiced in Iwama, which was the Aikido that was practiced in Iwama had tremendous echoes of spiritual echoes, so to speak. And the vibration of the space, the dojo itself, the land around it. Iwama was a small town right close to this one mountain, or this small range of mountains, but leading to this one mountain, the Tagosan. And the whole vibration just around that whole area had a tremendous spiritual quality about it. There was a beautiful Buddhist monastery, a Buddhist temple on one mountain, and a Tagosan, which was a Japanese Shinto shrine on the top of a Tagosan. And then there was this incredibly beautiful Shingon temple, small little Shingon temple next to the waterfall behind the mountain that we used to spend a lot of time at. And the whole area was just had this quality of spirituality interwoven in nature. And that's a very strong cultural vibration in Japan, is how much spirituality and nature actually intertwine with one another. And the Iwama Dojo had that vibration about it quite a bit. And the practice had this very dynamic, energetic resonance about it. But Saito Sensei himself, although there were the monthly Shinto prayer sessions at the Jinja, at the Iwama Jinja, which was right across the small street from the Iwama Dojo, and Doshu would often come and participate in those Shinto ceremonies, and Saito Sensei would participate in. He would never actually broach any direct spiritual topics, and so I was very hungry for that as well. And so I found a lot of my interest in spirituality was focused on the yoga and the contemplation in the yoga and the meditation that I was experiencing in the Zen during the retreats that Tomonaga Sensei was organizing, as well as I started Japanese tea ceremony at that time. And for most of us, I think for the community that lived in Iwama, it was a very special community at that time. It's very difficult to say what exactly it was like. There were people that came to Iwama that would stay for 1 week, 2 weeks, or 1 month, and they would train, and then they would go back home. And there were people that would come and save up all their money, and they would come and they would be uchideshi and train in Iwama, and for a longer period of time, maybe 6 months or even a year, somebody like Pat Hendricks or Louis Jumonville. And they would commit all of their intention on being uchideshi and really devoted towards Saito Sensei. And then there was a smaller group that had, for whatever reason, had moved out of the dojo and created a life in Japan. And we were committed to Aikido. We were training full time, but we were also involved with teaching English in order to support our lives. We were involved in different arts. For me, it was Japanese tea ceremony and shiatsu and yoga. For Louis de Quiros, he was doing Kyudo at the time, and his partner Sana was also doing Kyudo at the time, and my partner Cynthia was doing tea ceremony, and Miles was both doing Kyudo and tea ceremony. Miles Kessler was both doing in Japanese language, and we were engaged with living in Japan without an end date. We were living kind of through Japan, and as in our lives, we were engaged with doing what we loved, and Aikido was a big part of that. And but we had kind of found a way to stay there indefinitely, which was an incredible gift at that time. And Bjorn, you had been a part of that and had lived there. You'd actually lived with me for a while, with myself and Cynthia for a while. And then you came back and you had your partner and lived in another house with Sonoko for a while. But there was this kind of quality of people who had moved to Japan and had created a community where we were supporting each other with our lives. We were passing on work to each other. We were able to kind of find a way to live in Japan, um, and flourish and thrive and do what we loved. And it was a very strange experience because it was a time when you really felt out of the stream of normal life. When I left the United States, when I wasn't I was no longer in the stream of normal of normal life in terms of getting a career, getting a job. And I remember being in Iwama, and somebody who was visiting for a 2-week period from California, and he came to me, he says, "So what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I practice Aikido." He says, "No, no, no. What do you do in life?" And I said, "Well, I practice Aikido." And he goes, "No, no, no." And he started to get really upset with me. I said, "No, what's your job?" I said, "This is my life. I don't have a job. This is it." And he looked at me like I was from outer space. Like he couldn't process that I didn't have a job and I wasn't taking break from this job to do Aikido. I didn't have a job back home. I had nothing back home. This was it. And there was a time when I was at the end of my stay, after my second visit, 2 months, it had been 2 months Uchideshi, and then I came back for 2 more months. At the end of that 2 months period of Uchideshi, I had $20 to my name. I had $20, that was it. So I realized I needed to get out of the dojo and get a job in order to be able to continue to stay. And that's why I moved out. Actually, Louis DeKiros and I moved out at the same time. We found a little tiny place in this bamboo forest where we lived for about 6 months before we found other places and continued to live. But we taught English to make to pay the bills and to continue our lifestyle. And we were lucky enough that there was a need for that. And we found, it was just like an extraordinary time. We were living on the edge all the time. We didn't know whether we could stay in Japan from 1 month to the next. Our visas were constantly being reevaluated by the Japanese authorities, and we had to do all the different paperwork in order to be able to get permission to stay longer. But it was such a living in the moment and giving everything to what you love type of experience that it was, it was extraordinary. And I think there was a shift, at least for myself, in realizing that I think it was on my second visit, and it was about after I think I had been in Japan for like a year, and I came back to the United States. And for that year in Japan, I kept on referring to California as home. And when I went back to California, and I would talk with friends and family, I would refer to Japan as home. And it was a weird thing. And it was like thinking, okay, I thought, oh, well, Japan has become my home. And I remember flying back after that visit to the United States, and after getting out of the airport and getting on the train and had all my stuff, and the train car was empty except for 2 old Japanese fishermen, and they were having this animated chat with each other. And I sat down, and they both stopped, and they both turned and slowly turned and looked at me, and they looked at me like I was this man from Mars, like I was like the strangest thing they'd ever seen. And I realized at that time, oh, Japan is not my home either. And it dawned on me, no, that what had shifted at that point in time is that home has to be where I am. And I dropped the conditioning that I was away from home, and I started to choose to be at home where I lived. And it seemed like a small thing, but for me that was a really big radical shift in my identity. And I think with most of the other community that we live together with, Bjorn and I lived with Miles Kessler and Luis Bernardo de Quiros and others, that had been kind of what had happened with each one of us. We were no longer away from home. We were, because we had left home and there was no kind of going back. We were living where we were, and it wasn't like we were planning on making Japan our permanent residence. We knew it was temporary, but the future was totally open, and what came forward after that was completely unknown. But we had made a transition out of the cultural conditioning of this is what you do with your life: high school, grade school, high school, university, job, marriage, family, blah 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 blah, to we were doing what we loved, and then we were just letting it unfold from there. And we had no idea. We had no plans of opening dojos. We had no plans of anything, really. We had lots of ideas, but the idea of becoming professional Aikido teachers, that was not on the radar. It was just about, literally just doing what we loved, and it had unfolded in certain ways. But we were blessed. I was blessed with the opportunity to do that, and I think it exists in everybody's life. I don't think it's unique to mine, but somehow all the combination of elements came together that allowed me to follow that passion and feel that experience of being in the right place at the right time. And I think you could resonate with what I'm talking about, Bjorn. No?
Yeah, definitely. I want to continue on this thread a little bit. We're shortly going to be ending the first session, and we're going to have a 10-minute break and then continue the second session that will go for 40 minutes as well. I think I still have a few things that I want to draw out of Patrick before we let the questions in. So, but just to roll back time a little bit, because I think I came to the dojo in spring of '87. And when I very quickly became friends with you and with Luis Bernardo de Quiros. And at that time, Miles Kessler wasn't there yet. So you two stood out, because I moved in as Uchideshi and I lived in the dojo. And then we had these two strangers, foreigners living in the village. And that was kind of like extraordinary. It's like, what are they doing? It's like your American friend had asked you, what are you doing? But we very quick, I had been on the road for over a year traveling in Asia. So I had started my process of kind of leaving home. And unbeknown to me, it just, like you said, we were on the one-way ticket. There was no return ticket. And
so that first time we met, I hadn't been to India yet.
No.
It was the second time.
But I do remember that we spoke about India, because I had just come from India, so we spoke about that connection and your yoga connection. And I think that's where we first connected up, really, more so to that connection than the Aikido connection.
Sure. I do remember that too.
Yeah.
I was intrigued with your trip through Tibet.
Yes. So we shared so much of that. And I think I want to pursue this a little bit for the second session before I let you in. So, but I have been on the road for a while, and I had started asking myself the questions about what life is about and what is my life about. And coming to Japan was because the first time I was in Japan in the spring of '87, I only stayed for 2 months, and I had spent 4 months in Tokyo before. So I had this first experience of Japan, which I completely fell in love with it. And then coming up and tasting Iwama, which is yes, a wonderful place to be. And actually I went back on the road for another year and a half in Asia.
Yeah.
So I didn't go home. I was still traveling.
Mm-hmm.
But this is going to be.
It was after that trip that I think we connected very deeply.
Yeah, let's get right back to that. But thank you, everybody. Please go make a cup of tea or whatever, and come back in 10 minutes. Same ID number, same password, and let me just follow on a little bit before we let you in. We'll let you know. Great. So I'm going to close this down now for now. So thank you so much, and see you in 10 minutes. Patrick, we can meet again if you want to on the private one.
Okay, good.
Cheers. Thank you. Okay, welcome back for the second session, everybody. Let's just wait a bit with the questions, and I'm just going to ask a few things of Patrick. What I'm trying to do with the Iwama Dialogues is kind of draw out the spiritual interest and the spiritual spark that has touched us, and many, I think many Aikido people are moved by that as well. So I want to kind of isolate it. I want to kind of isolate the inspiration or the drive towards something that we don't really know, that we are in one way seeking, knowingly or unknowingly, and which can be seen when you look back and you follow your life through. You can see a thread that we have followed, and part of that thread, like Patrick said, has to do with shedding and giving up and leaving things behind you and moving on. And I remember getting to know Patrick in this interest, and this is really why we connected. Of course, we love the Aikido, but it was really, for me, Patrick might have a different take on it, but my feeling was that this was connection of the same interest, the interest in something that we couldn't put our finger on, but we were really desiring and inquiring and having an interest in the spiritual. And that led to a lifelong friendship. And also we done a lot of mutual exploration, and we spent a lot of time together in this spiritual search after our days in Iwama, even leading up till the present day. So I just want to ask Patrick, if you don't mind, once again, to though we are Aikidoka, and Aikido is our lives we live, but I want to just bring it back to you and to remind you of, because when I met you, you lived alone, and you had set up your home, your house, your practices, and it was all spiritual practices. It was all geared towards spiritual understanding and inquiry. And we spent many evenings, if not nights, discussing and talking and you know, being excited about what the truth is and where it led on to.
You know, I think if to look at, I think the life in Japan was conducive for that in many different ways. One was the kind of getting off the grid, as I was saying before, and that psychological release of not being in the stream of conditioned behavior. The second was being in a culture where, you know, when you're living in your own stream, your own cultural stream, there are so many different things that stimulate your attention. Advertisements, newspapers, TV, music, everything is pulling on you and kind of engaging you to react to what's going on around you. But when I was in Japan, or when in such a foreign culture, all of the stimulus that was hitting most Japanese and pulling and tweaking and engaging them had zero impact on me, because the buttons that I'd grown up with didn't match the way Japanese culture influenced its citizens. So there was a certain sense of not being touched by Japanese culture and yet being in the middle of it. And it was this wonderful feeling of what they say of being in it but not being of it. And that gave a very big psychological relief to all that energy that was normally getting stimulated by culture was now suddenly liberated, and there was a space for investigation. And what was also incredible about Japan was that it offered, there was the opportunity to train with really talented people in spiritual artistic arts. Japanese tea ceremony was one that really supported me in many different ways. Shiatsu yoga, Kyudo, as I had mentioned before, for others, and Zen, Zen meditation. And these things were available to us as Westerners in Japan because if you expressed any interest, those doors opened up to you, because as Westerners, we were so strange that teachers would often want to see how we would respond to these types of traditions and these types of teachings. And if we were hungry and serious, we oftentimes could go quite deeply, very quickly, into a relationship with the teacher and a relationship with the practice. But I think the biggest click that I had, there were steps that occurred within the training in Japan, and Aikido supported a lot of that. But I distinctly remember my first trip to India, and identifying what I felt was a direction that was valuable or very important for me. And it was being in New Delhi, and that was in like 1989. So, and I was 20, I don't know, 23 years old. No, 26 years old. And New Delhi was really, really poverty stricken. And it was still, it still is to a large extent, but it was pretty dramatically intense to visit New Delhi at that point in time. And I remember walking from the YMCA. There's that YMCA that we stayed at a number of times, Bjorn. And I was walking down the street, and I ran into a beggar who was about the same age as me. And he had no legs, and his arms ended in kind of nubs. He didn't have any hands. And he was begging, he was asking for money. And I looked down at him because he was down on this kind of little square skateboard that allowed him to move around. And I looked down at him, and it was this radical kind of connection between him and I saw him, and I recognized he was more in contact with his inner landscape than I was in contact with mine. He was looking, it wasn't that he was happier than me, it wasn't that he was, wiser than me, it wasn't like, he wasn't enlightened or a spiritual teacher or anything like that, but there was something about him that he was more at home. He was more.
Hang on, Patrick. You got frozen right now, so just a second.
Okay, are we good?
You're good. Go. Sorry.
No problem. No problem. So finally, I think, what I would say, why don't we, I don't know if there's still people arriving or not, but I guess there was a moment in the training in Iwama where I witnessed one of the senior people do something tremendously horrendous and very cruel. And I don't necessarily want to go into the details of the event, but it shook me to my core to see that happen. and it was near the end of not the end of my stay, but in the middle of my second stay. So I'd been there for like, I think 4 years, 5 years. Let me wait for everybody to get on board, because otherwise, if I do this, nobody's going to catch the story. All right. So I think the story that I want to share with you, it directly relates to the question that Bjorn was asking about kind of there are certain levels that you go through, and I think everybody resonates with that. It's certain levels where you go through, you mature into certain other experiences of oneself, and one level that I feel it was valuable for me, both in the world of Aikido, but also in the world of spirituality, was this recognition that that like I had said before, there was a time when it was probably around, I think it's 1991 or 92, and it was my second visit, and I'd been there in Iwama for 5 years or so, and I'd witnessed one of the senior most teachers in the Iwama dojo do something incredibly cruel and vicious, and it was really quite horrendous to see that, and it shook me to my core, and I recognized that I was looking at these teachers, and I was looking at Saito Sensei as being the source of my Aikido, the source of Aikido. And there was so incongruent to what this person had done that I couldn't find a way to correlate the two, what Aikido was for me and what this person had done in front of me. But instead of losing faith in Aikido, I recognized that I'd been placing too much of the definition, or looking for the definition of Aikido externally, and letting somebody else define it for me. And it was at that point in time and that I realized that I can't look for this person to define Aikido for me. That's crazy, because what he just did there's no way, that's not possible. So I needed to give myself permission to look for what Aikido was for me. I needed to take that step for myself, because if I didn't, then I would have to leave the dojo and find another teacher and go, okay, now you tell me what Aikido is. But because I was in the community there, and the practice that was happening there was good, was very positive, very life affirming. But what I had witnessed was a dark expression of this human individual, and I let that go. But in letting that go, I had to come back to myself and give myself permission to discover, or to define, in a way, relate to Aikido directly through my own experience, and no longer rely on my teacher to define that for me. And that was a big step. And I think that's a very important step that most Aikidoka need to do, in order to become independent of the art. And Aikido is such, if it's going to be a spiritual, if it has any spiritual impact on the psyche, that has to be accessed directly through the individual. That they have to come to a place where they start to realize that the answer for them in terms of what Aikido truly is comes from within, doesn't come from without.
Mm.
The techniques, the practice, the tradition, these are externalities, but the internal discovery process, the taste of it has to come from inside out. And when that flipped in a very big way, and in allowing and giving myself permission to take that stand, it didn't mean that I didn't listen to my teacher. It didn't mean I didn't need a teacher anymore. Of course I needed teachers, but I no longer looked for my teacher as being the source of what Aikido was. I no longer looked for my teacher as being the definition of what Aikido was. I started to look in my own experience. I started to take responsibility for that for myself. And that was actually the beginning in many ways. And it was a step towards becoming independently responsible for my own Aikido. And still honoring the teacher, honoring the tradition, honoring the community, but I moved out of being a soldier. I was no longer a soldier after that. And that was an important step. And that was, for me, a very important spiritual step.
Patrick, after that incident and after this coming to terms with that, was that closer to your stay, closer to the end of your stay, or but because I remember by the time we were coming to individually, we were all coming to a closure with Iwama about the same time. You know, we more or less Iwama around 1 or 2 years from each other at the same.
It was actually the beginning of a lot of insight after that. That there was a tremendous growth in what happened in my meditation after that. There was a tremendous growth in my Aikido skills showed up after that. What showed up after that was is we used to do this thing in Iwama where we tried to block each other, and we would do it in a way that was, we didn't do it in a way that was demeaning towards the other. Most people didn't, but we would do it to test our strength, test our skills, and really try to engage each other. And I remember it was soon after this experience where I started to give permission, and I was holding somebody in Morote Dori, the two-handed grip on somebody's arm. And we would always do kokyunage at the beginning of the class. And we would hold on as strong as we possibly could to give the best possible grip for each person to develop. And there were people who had really strong grips and other people who had less strong grips. And I had a good strong grip, but I wasn't the biggest person on the mat by any means. But I remember, engaging that, and here I was setting up, and I was like, and I'm like going, wait a second, this is a kind of strength that doesn't make sense. And so I changed my narrative, and for some crazy reason, I imagined, and it came out of nowhere, I imagined I was holding on to my brother. I have a brother, and I was literally holding on to him. And for some reason, he needed to be held. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I wanted to protect him. And I remember this going through my mind, and it just like went plop, 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 plop really quickly. And out of this whole thing came this love where I held him. And, of course, it wasn't my brother, it was somebody else. But I held the person, and I held him from that place of love, and he couldn't move. He couldn't do anything. And I realized, it was like a holy shit moment. And I'm holding him, and I'm not efforting it as the way I used to effort. And I was like, oh, this is different. And I held him with love, and he couldn't move. And then I realized, oh, I better let go, because he's not going to be able to do the technique unless I let him have some space. And it started to show up in the class, and I couldn't engage this type of energy because it stopped the training in a lot of ways, but it opened up the training in so many different ways that it just like unfolded in 1,000 different directions. And then things started cascading in a lot of different ways. Meditation started opening up. Bjorn came back from India, and there was just all this different things happening, and some radical experiences happened later on that just were amazing. But I distinctly remember it all cascaded after this experience of giving myself permission and then opening up to different ways of looking at the practice. And that was primarily one aspect. It was a very beginning basic practice of recognizing the power of love, literally, and not like being nice. It wasn't about the power of being nice. It was this kind of doubtless space that shows up when you go, I'm here for you, and I'm not going anywhere, and I will do everything I possibly can to be with you, to protect you. And it showed up in such a strange way, and it was such a beautiful thing to discover. And after that, my practice changed a lot.
That's great. I think maybe this is a good time to let questions in, even though I know we can speak plenty more, and there's a lot to cover. But I do believe this would be a good point to let questions in. So if you do have a question, please unmute yourself and just ask Patrick anything. Otherwise, we just continue.
Hi, Patrick. It's Tony here.
Yes, Tony.
I can see that you've been there and done it, because we've all got different, we'll say, teaching abilities. And I know you all, even though I wasn't in your era, but I've studied you all, obviously. And when I'm trying to work out, we all done this solid basic that Sensei taught us. And that's sort of like rooted in all of us. You know, whenever I look at any of you, that the names you've talked about is rooted deep inside us. But I saw a video of you and Miles where you was almost dancing, you know, like flowing in, I don't know if it was in Israel. So do you, have you sort of forsaken this, what I call the solid Iwama technical, and because you've now, we'll say, taken all this knowledge that you've talked about and moved it into the spiritual, where I believe it's a far greater experience, but have you sort of walked away from the technical? Because I haven't actually seen you on any YouTube or anything where, like, if I look at Lewis, I see still strong, solid basic there. Have you moved away?
No, not at all. No, not at all. I think for me, the technicals, that my technique has improved, and I still actually understand it in a better somatic, intelligent way than I did before. And my form from the outside is still the same, but it's actually better integrated, better aligned. And I expect all my students to do the technical format, the Iwama traditional technical format. But I use that as a foundation for moving and working with relationship and principles, and then later on perspectives. For me, I separate them into three. I said it's techniques, principles, and perspectives. And when I engage in perspectives, I let go of the technique. So if you see me teach a seminar, if you see me teach a class where I'm working on principles, I'm not working with a technical practice. It's like I consider them two domains which are parallel to each other, and eventually they become one. But if you're working techniques, the priority in your mind is to duplicate the technique in the proper fashion, and connection is secondary.
I just worry that I'm like where you, well, I don't know about where you are, but I'm on the spiritual path,
Sure.
rather than, and I think like Bjorn, more than I am on the technical path.
Sure.
I worry that I criticized in the past so many teachers who say this is basic, but they're showing 6th Dan basic, not what a 1st Dan should be. So we're trying. I just worry that are you diluting what they should know rather than, because you know.
No, it's like okay. So let's say if I was a teacher of poetry, right? And from the beginning, I would teach, Shakespeare. I would teach different poets to the poet students, and I would teach the basic form, the basic different styles of poetry, and blah 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 blah. And that goes, language, grammar, and all of the things that go with that. And then I would say, okay, now let's forget about that. I want you to write a poem. Okay, just write a poem. And even if you only know 10 words, you could write something. And you have to connect with something else. It's not about using this part of your brain. You have to connect with something else. And that something else, I think, is very vital and important for a beginner to connect up with from day one, and not to wait until they've reached 4th Dan. So I tried to separate them so as not to mix them up. So that, okay, now we're working techniques. Okay, now we're working principles. Okay, now we're working techniques. Okay, now we're working principles. And so that they get a taste for both. And then eventually these two come together. I try not to dilute. I'm not trying to dilute anything. I don't want to make Aikido light, but I want to work in the realm of, when I work in techniques, I work with the technical framework. Principles are there, of course. But when I work in principles, form and is there as well. But I want people from day one to get a sense of what it means to be in contact with each other, to be relating to each other, to be from center to center, from grip into body, and to how to respond to the pressure in a way where they learn how to move in the right place at the right time. These are different skills that I think to a large extent have been influenced by my time with Peter Ralston. And Peter Ralston was very helpful in developing those skills, as well as Robert Nadeau and others. But for me, I try to engage the students in different domains so that they get a taste of each domain, and so they develop maybe a little bit more slowly in the technical skill, but they're a little bit more mature in the sense of they can see the territory a little bit bigger, rather than only thinking that the territory is technical. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Sort
of, yeah. But really, we can't help, like with what was Bjorn saying earlier, we can't help once we see the light of the spiritual path, we can't, that's a bigger flame than the solid technical.
Sure, of course, yes.
But I just looking at some of the guys like yourself, Miles and that, and Bjorn, and it's starting to become more flowing, where ours was more, you said yourself in Iwama, it's more a fight for survival out there,
in many ways, yeah.
And I wouldn't want to teach that now, and I don't think any of us would, but I just, I just wondered where you were going in it.
It's like I do feel like the value of the traditional approach is important for beginners to get a taste of. I wouldn't want them to have to go through the same type of physical abuse that I went through in order to access that technical skill. But at the same time, I also would want them to have a good grounding in the form and the understanding of the mechanics of it, which is very valuable. But there's so much more that I want to include, and I don't want to dilute the traditional technical aspect, but I want to be able to get them to a place where they can access that from day one, because I think there's so much depth in feeling, how am I relating to this person from a body to body sense of self, from an emotional sense of self, from a conscious sense of self, and how that impacts my movement, how that impacts my responsiveness, how that impacts who I am with that other person. And then to go back, okay, this is how you do Shio-nage and Motewaza. You go 90 degrees, you go this way, you go that way. And this is the framework for that. And to be able to separate those two is very liberating for me. And that's how I manage it.
Okay.
And not all teachers do the same thing. I think Lewis has a different pedagogical approach, and Bjorn has a different pedagogical approach, and Miles has a different pedagogical approach. But I think we're all attempting to pass on to the best of our ability what we feel is valuable in the art, and as I'm sure you are as well. And when you do, I think I resonate with what you're saying. When we sense that spiritual domain, the thing opens up to so many different dimensions that it becomes literally a practice without limit. And there's no way, at the beginning, this is the metaphor I have. At the beginning, I used to think I had to try to contain it all, to get it all. And now it feels more like I'm in a limitless ocean. And the most important thing is I just want to be able to swim in it comfortably. And I want to be able to be free in it. I want to be at home in it. And then it's always new. It's always new. It's always fundamentally, and I don't try to contain it because it can't be contained. It's just too big.
Okay, I'll come back later when everybody else has had a say, but thank you.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you, Bjorn.
Anyone else? Claudia, or you want to say?
Yeah.
Hello, Claudia.
I feel the physical, the formal aspect of Aikido is very, very important, because I followed different spiritual paths, and I saw again and again they lose something, they lose the bottom, and then come such unmature phrases, even from the teachers. Oh, we are the poor one, we are the pure ones.
Sure.
And to going back always again to these techniques, and everybody can see she cannot do it she can, but not she should do better, and all this. It is so healthy, it is so good. And also I mean, then it is this fullness you also mentioned, because the spiritual path is wonderful, but it is really difficult not to lose the right path.
Yes.
And Aikido helps, I think.
Yeah. I think what you're saying, because it's so easy for us to lose ourselves in a spiritual path where we become disconnected from our world. And Aikido really helps us bring that spiritual insight, any insight, back into a physical relationship where I'm reflecting what I'm seeing, what I'm experiencing is getting reflected back to me. So it grounds our insight in our relationships. And this is what I think is so valuable, is to bring that insight into a grounded experience of who we are in relationship to pressure, in relationship to another person.
Yeah. And very often it is so intellectual. It is, and I feel it is less the case with Aikido.
It can be. It's important that we stay authentic and really fundamentally real in our relationships and in the practice, and not to get too much into
Speculations.
the speculation, but also into forms, but into something which is emerging in the moment, which is something that's real. It's new, it's spontaneous, and that Aikido has that ability to help ground us in the moment, and I really appreciate that. So I agree with you completely. Thank you for bringing that up.
Anyone else?
I have a question, Patrick.
Yes.
Sensei. So, at the risk of asking you to define an ocean, I was going to ask you, what is Aikido and how do you see it? You've said a lot of different things, but I still wanted to ask.
So I'll give you two answers. I'll give you the answer that I give to beginners who come in the door. They say, Aikido is the martial art you want to use when you're in a fight with somebody you love. The second is, if you recognize that you exist in a systemic relationship, that we literally are one, that we fundamentally live, that our welfares are tied, and that is becoming more apparent as time goes on, especially in these times concerning the COVID-19 and the different challenges we're facing. And we realize that we exist in a systemic biosphere that fundamentally functions as one complete living system, living organism. If you're in relationship with another person and you live in that relationship with that other person, and you live by grace of that relationship with that other person, how do you relate to conflict now? And Aikido provides that answer. The essential perspective of Aikido provides that answer. It provides the answer to resolving conflict in the domain of bringing the system back into balance in such a way that I honor myself and I honor my relationship with the other. That for me is how I would define it. It's bringing ourselves back into a realization of unity and attempting to navigate conflict in that realization. Because there is unity that exists, and there's still conflict that also exists. So how do I deal with conflict within myself? How do I face my own shadow? How do I face my own imbalances? Do I attempt to dominate, destroy, separate? Or do I attempt, or am I a victim to it? Do I lose my center? Or do I fundamentally recognize the totality of my system and find a way to reestablish a new balance that brings the whole system into a better understanding of itself? That's more complicated explanation. But that would be my response. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's interesting. It's nice to hear you kind of put it, in a few sentences, because in a way it's like I said, you live it and you express it and you offer sort of all kinds of like glimpses of it, but it's nice to hear in a few sentences kind of what it is to you. So
thank you for the question. Thank you. Cool. All right.
I have a question, please.
Yes.
You said that yoga helped you a lot, probably physically, if I got it right, at Iwama with the physical heart training.
Yeah.
Are you still practicing yoga at a sort of spiritual level now? Are you bringing this into your Aikido? Is it changing in any way your Aikido?
So here's the thing, and this is a great question, so thank you for asking it. One big problem of Aikido that I find, so if you went to a yoga studio and you went to the yoga teacher and you said, hey, I want to train in yoga. I want to commit to it. I'm ready to give everything to it. And the teacher said to you, well, that's great. Wonderful. Welcome. But, you know, after 30 years of training, you're probably going to need knee surgery and maybe a hip replacement. Would you practice that art? Probably not. But that's what happens in Aikido. If you commit to Aikido in a full way, the way it's practiced now, most people need surgery after 30 years of training. So there's something wrong there in the way we train. We should be better physically after 30 years of in Aikido, not cripples. I want to develop skill. I want to develop strength. I want to develop center. I want to develop these things. But why in hell are we crippling ourselves in doing so? What is it about the approach that is missing this component? Why do I have to practice yoga so that I stay healthy in my Aikido? Shouldn't Aikido be, Bjorn and I used to train a lot in Tai Chi. We did a lot of Tai Chi together and a lot of Qigong together. We found a great teacher in Scuba down the road from Iwama, and we would go there like 2 times a week. You remember that, Bjorn?
Yes.
And the practice was beautiful. But Tai Chi makes you stronger, doesn't make you weaker. Qigong makes you stronger, doesn't make you weaker. But Aikido, if you only practice Aikido, especially in the way I was practicing in Iwama, I would be destroyed by now. I probably wouldn't be able to continue. But because I was doing other arts that balanced out the amount of abuse and impact that was going, my body is good. I haven't, no surgery, no nothing. I'm, knock on wood, I'm in some of the best shape I've been in years. But it's because I've taken responsibility for that. And I think Aikido needs to help facilitate that more. Somehow we've lost that.
Can I follow that a bit, please?
Sure.
Spiritually, is it helping you with your
Yoga.
Aikido? I got it
Yoga?
like physically, yes, but yoga helps you spiritually. Like
absolutely.
Meditation, mantras, or using the 7 or 9 centers or chakras, whatever you want to call them.
So yeah, I see that yes, it's too, the answer would be too long. I would be happy to talk to you about it another time, but absolutely yes, because I don't separate it anymore. It's not yoga and Aikido. It's life now. It's just life. And if there's a relationship between meditation, yoga, and Aikido, meditation is our relationship with our inner experience. Yoga is our relationship with our physical experience, our body. And Aikido's relationship with that is our relationship with another. All based on the same principle. All based on that one fundamental life positive, I am with you and I'm not against you principle.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, but you could get me going on that forever and we'd never stop talking. But yes. Sorry. Sorry. Anyway, maybe we have time for one more question. Bjorn, you want to add anything here?
No,
I'd like to ask one more.
I like it.
Can I ask one more?
Sure, Tony, go ahead.
This is a criticism of Sensei. He had a period that you'll all remember of where he wanted us to have the 3-second pause. And I hated that period because we had to do the weapons and he invented more weapons. And when we first started, and Claudia made me think about this, when I first started anyhow, the Aikido, it was spiritual because the dynamics, it was fast, it was brutal, but it lit the fire inside us. And then Sensei, he wanted this 3-second pause on everything. And we become, I think, really very good robots and precise. We become, you know, the techniques become precise. We found lots of faults that we had in the techniques.
Tony, we don't have much time. Tony, we don't have much time.
I just wondered what his thoughts were. I preferred the old way to the, because now the students all seem to be robots at that speed. What do you think?
Well, I remember that time, that transition, and we all kind of grumbled on that time too. One, it made us better teachers. Two, it forced us, Lewis, Miles, it's basically Lewis and Sana, myself, and Bjorn joined in on that. Alan Roberts joined in on that for a while. We rented a dojo in Mito, and it was the Budokan in Mito, and we used to pay like $2, and we could train there for $2 every session, and it was even less than $2, and we had this huge dojo to ourselves, and we'd go and train there like 3 times a week in the mornings, and we would do all the fast, hard, creative training that we wanted to, and we would rotate, and each person would lead each session and decide what we were going to do. So we kind of cultivated the capacity to teach each other. And Saito Sensei, in his, I could understand why he did that, because he wanted to systematize the weapons work and get it laid down and have a clear framework. And it helped us become good teachers. But we were lucky enough that we had another venue to stretch all those other muscles that you're talking about. And so for us, it wasn't a problem, because we went and we did all the fast and dynamic training that we needed to do on our own. And we just took responsibility for that, because we realized we weren't going to get it in the Iwama Dojo at that time in terms of weapons work. And so we needed to go out and explore those aspects and push those limits independently, which we did, which was a good thing for us. But it wasn't something that we could do in the class, because there oftentimes were, if there was one beginner in the class, Saito Sensei would bring the class down to that level and try to adjust it to incorporate that beginner, which was a very good thing. But that's the way it went. I'm getting the sign from Bjorn.
We're running out of time. A lot more to speak about. Maybe we can arrange another time. But I think we're over for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Patrick. Sorry for the disruptive power break, but we're going to have something up recorded anyway tomorrow.
Cool. Thank you, guys, and feel free to reach out, and if you have some personal questions or anything that came out of this talk tonight, feel free to email me. I'm happy to engage you to the best of my ability. And but I hope you have a good evening, and thanks to Bjorn for organizing this, and everybody have a great continuation. So thanks, Bjorn. Thank you all.
Thank you, Patrick.